There is a word in Genesis 25 that appears only 3 times in the entire Torah in this specific construction, and every time it carries the weight of a final verdict. The text says that after Esau ate and drank and rose and went his way, he despised his birthright. The Hebrew is bazah, verb that does not mean to neglect or to underestimate or to make a foolish mistake. It means to treat as light, to regard as contemptible, to hold in such low esteem that the thing itself becomes worthless in your hands because you have declared it so. And the author of Genesis does not let us soften this. There is no narrative pause for Esau's perspective. There is no editorial comment about his exhaustion or his hunger or the unfairness of Jacob's manipulation. There is only the flat, unambiguous statement that when Esau looked at the birthright double portion, the leadership of the clan, the covenant promise that had been passed from Abraham to Isaac and was now waiting for him, weighed it against a bowl of red stew and found the stew heavier. This is the problem the passage creates, and the church has never quite known what to do with it. For centuries, preachers have turned Esau into a foil for Jacob, a cautionary tale about impatience, a proof text for the danger of letting physical appetite override spiritual priority. And all of that is true, but it is not the full truth. The full truth is that the text does not give Esau any room to recover. Look at the structure of the chapter. 27 verses are devoted to the birth of the twins, their growth, the favoritism of their parents, and the transaction over the stew. Then the chapter ends with a short notice about a famine and Isaac's journey to Gerar. That is it. Esau does not get a second scene in this chapter. He does not get a moment of remorse. He does not get a conversation with Isaac about what he has done. He eats, he rises, he goes his way, and the narrator closes the door with that single word baza as if to say the case is closed. And that is disorienting because we are used to stories where mistakes lead to repentance or at least to consequence. But this story simply names the contempt and moves on. The word itself does theological work that a translation cannot fully carry. In English, despised sounds like an emotion, a feeling of disgust or scorn. But baza is not primarily an emotion. It is an action of valuation. When the prophet Samuel tells King Saul that God has rejected him because he did not obey, the verb used is also baza. Saul treated the command of the Lord as contemptible. When David writes in Psalm 51 that God does not despise a broken and contrite heart, he uses the same root. It is a word that measures worth. Esau looked at the birthright and declared it worth nothing compared to what his body wanted in that moment. That is not a lapse in judgment. That is a verdict on what he believed about the promise. And the terrifying thing is that the text does not argue with him. It simply records the verdict and moves on. This is where the application must land. And it must land hard because the distance between Esau and the reader is much shorter than we imagine. The birthright was not merely property. For the firstborn son in the ancient Near East, the birthright carried the double portion of the inheritance. Yes, but more than that, it carried the spiritual and familial authority to carry the covenant forward. Abraham had been promised that, through his offspring, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. That promise was now sitting on Esau. He was not just selling a share of the family wealth. He was selling his place in the story of redemption. And he sold it because he was hungry. Most readers have never been hungry that way, but every reader has been desperately hungry for something, for approval, for relief, for a moment of pleasure, for an escape from pressure. In that hunger, they have made trades that felt small at the time and later revealed what they actually valued. The bowl of stew is never just a bowl of stew. It is whatever you are willing to trade the promise for. Here is the detail that makes the open loop work. The text says Esau swore an oath to Jacob. He did not just agree verbally. He put his name to it in the most binding form available in his culture. An oath in the ancient world was not a casual promise. It was a self-curse. If you broke it, you were calling down judgment on yourself. Esau swore away his birthright willingly, with full legal force, and then he ate and drank and rose and went his way. The order matters. He did not eat first and then regret the trade. He ate, he was satisfied, and then he went his way as though nothing of significance had happened. The author is telling us that Esau did not feel the weight of what he had done because he did not believe the birthright had weight to begin with. That is what baza means, to treat as light. The thing itself was heavy. The covenant promise was the heaviest thing in the world. but Esau's estimation of it was so low that the weight could not reach him. And then the author does something remarkable. In the very next chapter, when Isaac wants to bless Esau and Jacob steals the blessing, Esau cries out with a great and bitter cry. He weeps, he begs, he says, "Bless me, even me also, my father." And the reader, if they are paying attention, feels a flicker of sympathy. But the text does not extend that sympathy, because the blessing is not the birthright. The blessing is a separate event. Esau wept over the loss of the blessing, but the text never says he wept over the loss of the birthright. He swore away the birthright with an oath and walked away satisfied. He only grieved when he saw that the blessing, spoken word of favor had been taken too. And that distinction exposes something uncomfortable. Esau did not value the birthright when it was in his hands. He only valued the symbols of its blessing, the honor, the public recognition once those symbols were given to another. He wanted the appearance of the promise without the actual weight of carrying it. That is a condition the church has always recognized, but has rarely named with this precision. Part of what makes this passage so difficult is the silence of God. God does not appear in this scene. There is no divine voice condemning Esau. There is no prophecy. There is only the human transaction, the oath, the stew, and the narrator's closing judgment. And that silence is itself a theological argument. The text is saying that the value of the birthright was not something God needed to enforce. It was self-evident. The promise had been spoken. The covenant had been cut. Abraham had believed, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Isaac had received the promise and was walking in it. The birthright was not a mystery. It was the living continuation of everything God had been doing since Genesis 12. And Esau looked at it and said, in effect, that it was not worth staying hungry for. The silence of God is the silence of a courtroom where the evidence has already been submitted and the verdict is a foregone conclusion, which means the person who reads this passage and feels a flash of discomfort is precisely the person the text is aimed at. The comfortable reader, the one who has always identified with Jacob's cunning, or with Isaac's blindness, or even with Rebekah's scheming, that reader can keep the story at arm's length. But the reader who feels exposed by Esau, who recognizes the impulse to trade the permanent for the immediate, who has sworn away something they barely understood in order to satisfy a craving that passed an hour later, that reader has been caught by the text. And the text offers no easy resolution. It does not tell Esau about a path back. It does not give him a second chance. It simply records the trade and moves on, leaving the reader to sit with the question of what they themselves have treated as light. The tension point on which part 1 must end is this: the story is not over for Esau, but the narrator has already made his judgment known, and the reader is left wondering whether the judgment is the narrator's bias or the truth of the matter. The answer is in the detail that the church has often missaid. The word baza is not the narrator's opinion. It is the narrator's report of Esau's own action. He despised it. The verb describes what he did, not what the author thinks of him. And that means the text is not condemning Esau from the outside. It is reporting what Esau did to himself. That is the weight the next half of the script will have to carry. That is the weight the next half of the script will have to carry, the weight of a word that reports not what God thinks of Esau, but what Esau thought of the promise. And the text never lets him off that hook. It does not soften the report. It does not produce a later verse saying Esau repented or that God had mercy on him in the end. Instead, the author of Genesis closes the chapter with Esau walking away satisfied, and then the next chapter shows him crying over the blessing he lost, but the narrator still does not say he wept for the birthright. That is the most devastating silence in the story. Esau grieved the loss of his father's spoken favor with public honor, the material advantage, the place of prominence among his siblings. He did not grieve the loss of the covenant. He did not grieve the loss of being the one through whom the promises of Abraham would flow to the nations. He grieved because his brother had taken something he wanted, not because he had himself destroyed something sacred. And the narrator, by refusing to let Esau express remorse for the actual contempt, is making a theological argument that the New Testament will later pick up with a single, brutal word. The writer of the letter to the Hebrews looks back at Esau and calls him biblos, a Greek word that means profane, unhallowed, common. It is the same root used in the Septuagint for the opposite of holy. A biblos person is one who treats holy things as ordinary, who walks into sacred space as if it were a marketplace, who weighs the promises of God against the cravings of the body and finds them equal. The word is not a description of Esau's hunger. It is a description of his fundamental orientation. He was not a man who made one bad decision. He was a man whose entire framework of valuation was corrupted. He did not see the birthright as holy. He saw it as a commodity to be traded for whatever satisfied him in the moment. And the writer of Hebrews does not exaggerate. He simply names what the Genesis narrative has already shown: Esau was profane because he treated the holy as common. He could not repent of that because he could not see it. The only thing he saw was that he lost the benefits. But there is a deeper layer to this word biblos that the short reading misses. In the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures that the writer of Hebrews knew intimately, biblos is used to describe everything that violates sacred space. Leviticus uses it for the person who eats the holy offerings without authorization. Ezekiel uses it for the priests who fail to distinguish between the holy and the common. The word carries the weight of boundary violation, not just a lack of reverence, but an active crossing of a line that should never be crossed. And when Hebrews applies this word to Esau, it is not saying that Esau was merely indifferent. It is saying that his contempt was an act of sacrilege. He did not just neglect the birthright. He violated it. He reached into sacred space and traded it for a bowl of stew. The word biblos is not a synonym for mistaken. It is a synonym for defiled. And that changes how the reader understands both the severity of Esau's act and the irreversible nature of the consequence. You can repent of a mistake. You can be forgiven for a crime. But you cannot undefile what you have profaned. The contamination is in your own hands. This is where the cultural reality of the ancient oath becomes physically present in a way that demands more than a quick glance. In the ancient Near East, an oath was spoken aloud, often accompanied by a raised hand or a gesture that called the gods to witness. It was not a private contract. It was a public declaration that bound the speaker under the authority of the divine. Esau swore to Jacob. The text uses the Hebrew shava, which is the verb for taking an oath, a verb that shares its root with the word for 7, the number of completion and covenant. When Esau swore, he was completing a transaction that the culture considered irreversible unless the gods themselves intervened. There was no going back to the market the next day and renegotiating. The stew was eaten. The oath was spoken. The birthright was gone. And the physicality of that moment is worth sitting in because the text gives us just enough sensory detail to feel the weight of the room. Imagine the scene: the two brothers in the tent, the smell of lentil stew filling the space, the steam rising from the bowl, Jacob standing over the pot with his hand on the ladle, Esau collapsing from exhaustion after a day in the field, his body trembling, his throat dry, his vision blurring from hunger. Jacob does not offer the bowl for free. He demands the birthright. Esau, still panting, his words coming in gasps, says, "I am about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me?" He is not making a rational calculation. He is declaring that the birthright has no survival value in this moment. And that is the lie, because the birthright was never about survival. It was about identity. It was about being the son who would carry the story of redemption into the next generation. Esau reduced it to utility, and when he could not find a use for it in his immediate hunger, he classified it as worthless. And the oath he spoke sealed that classification permanently. The application here is not about stew. It is about every moment a person looks at the holy thing, the promise, the calling, the relationship, the covenant, and asks what it can do for them right now. The moment we begin evaluating the sacred by its immediate usefulness, we have already treated it as common. We do not need to sell our birthright. We need only to ask, what good is this to me today? And the answer will almost always be not as much as the thing I want now. The birthright was not going to feed Esau in that hour. It could not stop his hunger, so he traded it for something that could. The logic is impeccable until you realize that the birthright was not meant to satisfy hunger. It was meant to carry a promise across generations. But Esau was not thinking about generations. He was thinking about his stomach. And the text does not condemn him for thinking about his stomach. It condemns him for weighing the eternal with the immediate and finding the eternal lighter. That is the judgment that every reader must face. and the reader must face it not as an abstract theological principle, but as a concrete daily practice. What is the stew in your life? Is it the hour of scrolling when you should be praying? Is it the comfortable compromise that silences your conscience? Is it the relationship that demands you abandon your calling? The stew is always something that promises to satisfy now, and it always lies, because the satisfaction it gives lasts exactly as long as the meal, and then you are hungry again. But the birthright you traded for it is gone. The tension that part 1 left open the question of whether the narrator's judgment is fair, whether Esau deserved a second chance, finds its resolution not in a verse that answers the question, but in the structure of the entire patriarchal narrative. After Genesis 25, Esau does appear again. He marries, he has children, he becomes the father of the Edomites, a nation that will later oppose Israel. But he never carries the promise. He never stands in the line that leads to the Messiah. The birthright is permanently transferred to Jacob, and even Jacob's own sin and deceit cannot reverse that. The text is making a point that is difficult for modern ears. Some decisions are irreversible, not because God refuses to forgive, but because the act of despising the holy changes the despiser. Esau could not go back to being the firstborn in the covenant because he no longer valued the covenant. And you cannot restore what you have declared worthless. You can weep, you can beg, you can cry out for a blessing, but you cannot resanctify what you have profaned in your own heart. The irreversible nature of Esau's decision is not a statement about God's grace. It is a statement about human formation. Every time you trade the eternal for the immediate, you become the kind of person who makes that trade more easily the next time. The first trade feels like a crisis. The 100th trade feels like a habit. The 1000th trade feels like who you are. That is the weight the final paragraphs must carry, not to terrify, but to clarify. The story of Esau is not told so that the reader can feel superior. It is told so that the reader can recognize the subtle, daily version of the same transaction. The birthright is not a physical inheritance. It is the identity given in baptism, the promise sealed in the Eucharist, the calling to live as a child of the covenant in a world that offers 1,000 red bowls of satisfaction. The stew changes form constantly: a promotion, a relationship, a moment of relief, a chance to be admired, a night of escape, a quiet afternoon of hiding from the demands of discipleship. And the oath is often silent, spoken only in the heart: I will take this now and worry about the promise later. The text of Genesis 25 refuses to let that logic stand. It records the trade, names the contempt, and closes the chapter. And the reader is left with no comfort except the terrible clarity that the word baza is not a verdict from heaven. It is a mirror. Here is the final paragraph, the heavy thing this passage produces. The birthright was never Esau's to keep. It was always the promise of God passing through him. And when he despised it, he did not lose a possession. He lost a calling. The reader who has not yet learned to see the holy as holy will not recognize the moment it slips through their fingers. They will only feel the hunger, and they will trade, and they will walk away satisfied, and the only sound will be the narrator's voice, quiet and final, saying that they despised it.